Clarissa waved a crisp $20 bill in the air, her voice loud enough for all her garden party guests to hear. "Hey, you! Can you come trim these hedges? You people are usually so good with your hands." The man in the simple work clothes looked up from his own yard, his expression unreadable. She saw a simple black man in a quiet, wealthy neighborhood and assumed he didn't belong. But she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. A mistake that would one day put her own life in his hands. This story is about the quiet dignity that powerful people mistake for weakness, and the shocking moment when the truth comes out. If you believe that a person's character is more important than the color of their skin, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and listen to the very end. The lesson you'll learn might just change the way you see the world. Control was Clarissa Beaumont's religion. It was in the precise angle of the boxwoods that lined her walkway, each trimmed to an identical, unforgiving square. It was in the flawless, deep green of her lawn, a carpet so perfect it looked artificial. It was in the silent, deferential nod of her housekeeper, Maria, and the way her husband, Richard, always called before making a dinner reservation, even after 15 years of marriage. At 38, Clarissa had built a world that was a fortress against chaos. Her life in the exclusive enclave of Sterling Creek was a testament to order, wealth, and, most importantly, predictability. The houses were large, the cars were foreign, and the residents were, without exception, white. It was an unspoken rule, a comfortable fact of life that kept the property values high and the social circles tight. So when the moving truck rumbled down her quiet cul-de-sac and parked next door at the old Miller place, a knot of irritation tightened in her stomach. The Millers had been perfect neighbors, quiet, elderly, and barely visible. Their house, now sold, was the only variable on a street of constants. Clarissa stood at her bay window, a fine porcelain teacup held delicately in her hand, and watched. The movers were rough-looking men, but they were just hired help. Her focus was on the man directing them. He was tall and lean, dressed in a plain grey t-shirt and simple denim jeans. He was black. Clarissa took a slow, deliberate sip of her Earl Grey tea. It wasn't a loud, unwelcome arrival. There was no booming music, no shouting. In fact, the man's voice was calm and low as he gave instructions. He moved with an economy of motion, pointing to a spot on the lawn for a stack of boxes, then helping to guide a large sofa through the front door. There was nothing overtly offensive about him, and that, in a way, was what bothered her most. It was the quiet, unassuming presence of him. It was a disruption to the landscape. He didn't fit. She watched him for nearly an hour, cataloguing every detail. The car he'd driven, a sensible and slightly older sedan, was parked neatly at the curb. He wore simple, practical work boots. He didn't look like he belonged in a house that had sold for over $2 million. He looked, she thought with a sniff of disdain, like one of the movers. Her friend, Barbara, called later that afternoon. Her voice was a conspiratorial whisper. "Clarissa, did you see?" Of course she had seen. "A moving truck, yes," Clarissa replied, her tone deliberately flat. She didn't want to sound as rattled as she felt. "And?" Barbara pressed. "The new owner. He's—" She trailed off, letting the unspoken word hang in the air. "Yes," Clarissa said, her voice turning to ice. "I saw." There was a pause. "Well," Barbara said finally, "there goes the neighborhood." It was a cheap, cliché thing to say, but it perfectly captured the ugly thought blooming in Clarissa's mind. She'd spent years cultivating her perfect life, her perfect street. Now, a weed had appeared in her garden. Later that evening, as the sun set, she saw him again. He was standing on his new front porch, not doing much of anything, just looking out at the street. The moving truck was gone. The lights inside his house were on, casting a warm glow. He stood with his back straight, his hands resting on the porch railing. He wasn't a young man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. There were touches of grey at his temples. His face, in the fading light, was calm, thoughtful. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't loud. He was just there. And his presence felt like a judgment, a silent question posed to the carefully constructed world she ruled. She let the curtain fall back into place, her jaw tight. He wouldn't last long. People like that never did. They either couldn't keep up with the expenses or they couldn't handle the isolation. She would simply have to wait him out. She would be polite, of course. Cool, distant, but polite. She would treat him like a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address, something to be ignored until it was eventually removed. Her control had been challenged, and Clarissa Beaumont never, ever lost control. She would make sure he understood, in no uncertain terms, that he did not belong. The man's name, she learned from the new lettering on the mailbox, was Elijah Vance. The name was as simple and unremarkable as the man himself. In the days that followed, Clarissa watched him, waiting for the crack, the misstep, the sign that he was out of his element. It never came. His routine was maddeningly simple and consistent. Every morning, just before 7, he would emerge from his house, dressed in the same kind of plain, neat clothes. He would get into his modest sedan and drive away. He returned each evening around 6, sometimes carrying a single grocery bag. He would disappear inside his house, and she would see nothing more of him until the next morning. His silence was a strange kind of weapon. It was a blank wall she couldn't find a foothold on. He did not try to make conversation. When she was in her front yard and he was getting his mail, he would offer a small, polite nod if their eyes met. Nothing more. He did not smile broadly. He did not wave. He simply acknowledged her presence and moved on. The nod was worse than a friendly greeting. A greeting she could have rebuffed with a cold stare. But the nod, it was a gesture of quiet equality. It was the nod of a man who was neither seeking her approval nor intimidated by her disapproval. It infuriated her. On Saturday, he worked in his yard. Clarissa sat on her patio, pretending to read a magazine, but her eyes were fixed on him. The Millers had let the lawn go in their final months, and the flower beds were overgrown. Elijah worked slowly, methodically. He wore a simple pair of canvas gloves and used old, well-cared-for tools. He didn't use a loud, gas-powered edger. He used a manual one, the kind that made a quiet, rhythmic snick-snick sound as he pressed it along the driveway. He pulled weeds by hand, placing them neatly into a paper yard bag. He did not blast music from a speaker. The only sounds were the birds, the whisper of the wind in the oak trees, and the steady, quiet sounds of his labor. His competence was an insult. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His shirts, she noticed, were always clean. His shoes were never caked with mud. Even when his clothes were simple, he still looked put together. He had a straight back when he stood, and when he walked, he did not drag his feet like someone burdened by life. His eyes were quiet, but they were not weak. Clarissa found herself searching for flaws. A patch of uncut grass, a weed he missed, a clumsy movement. There were none. He worked with a patient, focused energy that seemed to say, "This is my home. I will care for it." She tried to assert her dominance in small ways. When her landscapers arrived with their roaring mowers and blowers, she made sure they spent extra time on the edge of her property, bordering his, sending grass clippings and dust flying onto his newly swept driveway. Elijah, if you noticed, gave no sign. He simply came out later with a broom and swept it clean. She hosted a small, impromptu brunch on her patio with Barbara and another friend, Catherine. They spoke in deliberately loud voices, their laughter sharp and brittle. They talked about their upcoming trip to Europe, the new Mercedes Richard had just bought her, the absurd cost of private school tuition. Every word was a carefully chosen brick in the wall of their wealth, meant to be overheard, meant to intimidate. Through it all, Elijah continued his work on the other side of the hedge, his movements unhurried, his focus unbroken. It was as if they were nothing more than background noise, a flock of noisy birds he had no reason to pay attention to. "He's just ignoring us," Barbara whispered, annoyed. "It's like he thinks he's too good for us," Catherine added. "No," Clarissa thought, her lips a thin line. "It's not that he thinks he's too good. It's that he doesn't think of us at all." And that was the most insulting thing of all. Her presence, her wealth, her status. It meant nothing to him. She was used to being the center of her world, the sun around which everything orbited. This quiet man next door lived in a different universe entirely, and the fact that he could so completely and calmly exist without her validation was a profound, personal offense. She would have to be more direct. His silence was a challenge, and she was going to force him to break it. Clarissa's campaign began on a Tuesday. She was on her cordless phone, pacing her front lawn, deliberately staying near the property line. She knew Elijah was home. His car was in the driveway. She pitched her voice to Carrie, a performance for an audience of one. "No, Barbara. I understand completely," she said, her tone dripping with forced sympathy. "You have to be so careful who you rent your properties to these days. The background checks, the credit scores. You let one bad element in, and the whole building goes downhill. It's just a fact." She paused, glancing toward his front window. "It's not about being prejudiced. It's about protecting your investment. You want quiet, responsible people who, fit in. People who maintain standards." She continued the charade for 20 minutes, a monologue of thinly veiled insults. She talked about property values, neighborhood covenants, and the importance of maintaining a certain aesthetic. Every word was a dart aimed at his house. When she finally went inside, she felt a grim satisfaction. He couldn't have missed that. He had to have heard. Yet there was no response. No curtain twitched, no door opened. The silence from his house was as solid and unyielding as it had been before. Her next move was more official. She scoured the Homeowners Association bylaws, a thick binder she kept in her home office. She was searching for a violation, any small infraction she could use as a weapon. She found one. Bylaw 7, Section C. All refuse and recycling containers must be stored out of public view, except on designated collection days. Elijah kept his 2 bins tucked neatly on the side of his house, partially hidden by a shrub. But from a certain angle on the street, the very top edge of the green recycling bin was visible. It was petty. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. She composed an email to the HOA board, phrasing it with grave concern. "Dear board members," she wrote, "I wish to report a violation at 112 Sterling Oak Court. The new resident is failing to properly store his refuse containers, which is a clear breach of our community standards and negatively impacts the aesthetic of our street. I trust you will handle this matter with the urgency it deserves." She signed it, "Sincerely, Clarissa Beaumont," knowing her name carried weight. Richard was a former board president. They wouldn't ignore her. 2 days later, she watched from her window as a polite, uniformed HOA representative knocked on Elijah's door. They spoke for a few minutes on his porch. Clarissa couldn't hear the words, but she could see the exchange. Elijah listened patiently, his expression calm. He nodded once. The HOA representative pointed toward the bins. Elijah nodded again. There was no argument, no anger. When the representative left, Elijah simply walked over to his bins and rolled them a few feet further back, completely out of sight. The entire interaction was over in less than 3 minutes. He had complied without protest, without emotion. He had taken her attack and neutralized it with simple, quiet obedience. It felt like a defeat. She had wanted a fight, a confrontation, a flicker of anger that would prove he was affected by her. Instead, he had given her nothing. He was absorbing her hostility like a sponge, leaving her with nothing but her own sour anger. She began to feel a strange obsession. His quiet life became a puzzle she needed to solve. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Where did he get the money for this house? She found herself creating narratives in her head. He must have won the lottery. Or maybe it was some kind of settlement money, from a lawsuit or an accident. It couldn't have been earned, not legitimate money. People who earned this kind of money looked like her husband. They wore tailored suits, drove German cars, and carried the easy arrogance of success. They did not wear simple jeans and drive 10-year-old sedans. The mystery of him was a constant, low-grade irritation. He was a blank page in a neighborhood where everyone's story was written in bold, expensive letters. And the more he receded into his quiet, orderly life, the more determined Clarissa became to rip that page out of the book entirely. She needed to escalate. She needed a public stage. Her annual garden party was just 2 weeks away. It would be the perfect venue to finally put him in his place. The day of the garden party arrived, a perfect Saturday in late May. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Clarissa's backyard was a masterpiece of controlled nature. White linen tablecloths billowed gently in the breeze. A string quartet played softly near the rose garden. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. It was the social event of the season in Sterling Creek, and Clarissa, in a flowing floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat, was the queen presiding over her court. Her friends and neighbors milled about the lawn, their laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses. Everything was perfect. Almost. From her vantage point on the patio, she could see over the neatly trimmed hedges into her neighbor's yard. And there he was, Elijah Vance. He was in his yard, as he often was on Saturdays, tending to his flower beds. He was on his knees, wearing his usual simple work clothes and canvas gloves, patiently turning the soil around a cluster of rose bushes. His presence was a smudge on her perfect painting. She could feel her friend's eyes occasionally drifting toward him. She'd heard the whispers. "Is that him? He's always out there. Doesn't he have anything better to do?" Clarissa smiled, a tight, predatory smile. An idea, ugly and brilliant, bloomed in her mind. This was her chance. She could finally expose him for what she believed he was: a handyman, a laborer, someone who belonged in the background of her life, not as an equal next to it. She waited for the perfect moment, when a lull in the conversation brought a pocket of relative quiet and a small group, including her friend Barbara, had gathered around her. She looked over the hedge, her voice clear and carrying. "Oh, goodness," she said, feigning exasperation. "I completely forgot to ask my landscapers to trim that back hedge. It's looking so unruly." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Then she turned her gaze directly on Elijah. She took a crisp, new $20 bill from the small purse looped over her wrist. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical. She held it up between two perfectly manicured fingers, waving it slightly in the air as if hailing a taxi. Her voice sliced through the genteel chatter of the party. "Hey, you!" The string quartet faltered for a moment. Conversations trailed off. Everyone turned to look. Elijah did not react at first. He continued to work the soil with his trowel. Clarissa's voice grew sharper, louder, laced with the condescending sweetness one might use on a child or a dog. Yoo-hoo! Over here! This time he stopped. He slowly pushed himself up from his knees, brushing the dirt from his gloves. He turned to face her, his expression completely unreadable. He did not look angry. He did not look confused. He simply looked at her, waiting. The silence in her backyard was now absolute. Every guest was watching, some with discomfort, others with fascinated amusement. This was the moment Clarissa had been engineering. It was a public branding. She was defining him in front of everyone who mattered in her world. "My hedges," she said, pointing with the $20 bill. "They need a trim. Can you come trim these hedges? You people are usually so good with your hands." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was unambiguous. It was a line drawn in the sand. She wasn't just asking a neighbor for a favor. She was attempting to hire a man she presumed was a menial laborer, based on nothing but the color of his skin and his simple clothes. She was putting him on display, reducing him to a stereotype for the entertainment of her guests. Barbara shot her a look that was a mixture of shock and nervous admiration. Clarissa held her smile, her posture regal, her hand with the $20 bill still extended. The entire world of Sterling Creek seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. She expected him to yell, to curse, to slink away in shame, or maybe even to meekly accept the money. Any of those reactions would have been a victory. Any would have proven her right. Elijah stood on the other side of the hedge, the afternoon sun casting his tall frame in a stark silhouette. He looked at the $20 bill in Clarissa's hand. He looked at her face, with its tight, expectant smile. Then his gaze swept over the silent crowd in her backyard, the men in their pastel polo shirts and the women in their summer dresses, all staring at him as if he were an animal in a zoo. He could feel the weight of their collective judgment, their curiosity, their discomfort. A lesser man might have flinched. A more volatile man might have exploded. Elijah Vance did neither. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He stripped off his canvas work gloves, one finger at a time, and tucked them into the back pocket of his jeans. He met Clarissa's gaze directly. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was no fear. There was just a profound and unnerving stillness, a deep well of calm that her venom could not seem to touch. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The string quartet remained silent. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the oak tree overhead. Clarissa's smile began to feel brittle, painted on. The confident posture she held felt suddenly fragile. His silence was not the silence of shame. It was the silence of power. Then he did something that no one expected. He nodded. It was a small, simple gesture, a slight inclination of his head. It was not a nod of agreement. It was not a nod of submission. It was a nod of acknowledgement. It was the same polite, distant nod he gave her when they passed each other at their mailboxes. It said, "I see you. I hear the words you are saying, and they have no power over me." After the nod, he turned his back on her. He turned his back on the $20 bill, on the silent, staring guests, on the entire, ugly spectacle she had orchestrated. He walked calmly to his garden hose, picked it up, and began to water his roses. The soft spray of the water was the only sound that broke the spell. The effect on the party was immediate and devastating. The tension didn't break. It curdled. Clarissa was left standing with her hand outstretched, the $20 bill looking cheap and foolish in her grasp. Her public power play had backfired spectacularly. His refusal to be humiliated had, in turn, humiliated her. He had not given her the satisfaction of a fight. He had simply dismissed her. He had rendered her invisible. A nervous cough broke the silence. Someone near the back of the crowd muttered, "Well, that was awkward." Barbara moved to Clarissa's side, her face flushed. "Clarissa, my God," she whispered. "Just drop it." Clarissa snatched her hand back as if the money had burned her. She forced a laugh, but it came out high and strained. "Can you believe the nerve? Some people have no sense of humor," she said to the group, but no one was laughing with her. Her guests began to talk again, but the light, festive atmosphere was gone. The conversations were now quiet, strained. People avoided her eyes. They had all witnessed her cruelty, but they had also witnessed his incredible grace. And in that silent comparison, she had been found wanting. The party limped on for another hour before people started making their excuses and leaving. The string quartet packed up. The waiters cleared away the half-empty glasses. Clarissa was left standing on her patio, surrounded by the wreckage of her perfect afternoon. Across the hedge, Elijah had finished his watering. He neatly coiled the hose and went inside his house, the back door closing with a soft click. He had not looked her way again. She stood there for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across her perfect lawn. She had tried to put him in his place, but instead, he had shown her hers. The quiet man next door was not weak. He was something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for. And for the first time in her meticulously controlled life, Clarissa Beaumont felt a sliver of genuine fear. The front door of Elijah's house closed, shutting out the strained laughter and clinking glasses from next door. The silence inside was immediate and welcome. The house did not smell of old people, as Clarissa might have imagined. It smelled of lemon oil and old books. The chaos of moving was gone. In its place was a quiet, Spartan order. The furniture was simple, functional, and well-made. There were no flashy pieces of art on the walls, no extravagant decorations. It was the home of a man who found comfort in simplicity, not display. He walked through the living room and into the kitchen, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floors. He pulled a glass from a cabinet, filled it with water from the tap, and drank it slowly, leaning against the counter. He looked out the kitchen window, which faced away from Clarissa's yard, toward the small patch of woods at the back of his property. His face, which had been a mask of calm composure outside, now showed the faintest trace of weariness. He closed his eyes for a moment and sighed, a deep, slow exhalation of breath. The sigh carried the weight of 1,000 similar moments, a lifetime of navigating a world that often saw him as less than he was. He finished his water, rinsed the glass, and placed it neatly in the dishwasher. Then he walked down a short hallway to a room at the back of the house. This was his study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was dense with purpose. One entire wall was covered in floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and they were not filled with novels or popular paperbacks. They were packed with thick, heavy volumes. The Principles of Neural Science, Gray's Anatomy, Walton's Brain, textbooks on neurosurgery, pharmacology, and diagnostic imaging. Journals with titles like Neuron and The Lancet were stacked neatly on a small side table. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, its surface clean except for a laptop computer and a single framed photograph. He walked over to the desk and picked up the photo. It was of a woman with a warm, brilliant smile. She was laughing, her head tilted back slightly, her hand resting on his arm. His late wife, Sarah. She had been a lawyer, a fierce advocate for civil rights. She had understood the wearying weight of prejudice better than anyone. "You have to let it be like water off a duck's back, Eli," she used to tell him. "Their poison is only powerful if you let it soak in." He traced the line of her smile with his thumb. He missed her wisdom. He missed her laughter. He had bought this house for the quiet. After Sarah's death from cancer 2 years ago, the big house in the city, filled with memories and the ghosts of their shared life, had become unbearable. His work at the university hospital was demanding, a constant battle against disease and trauma. He needed a sanctuary, a place where he could simply be. This quiet street, with its old trees and manicured lawns, had seemed perfect. He hadn't been naive. He knew what a neighborhood like Sterling Creek was. He had seen the way Clarissa Beaumont looked at him from the day he moved in. He recognized the look instantly. The appraisal, the dismissal, the calculation. He had seen it in the eyes of store clerks who followed him, police officers who pulled him over for no reason, and colleagues who expressed surprise at his credentials. Her behavior didn't enrage him anymore. It just saddened him. It was a tedious, predictable script. The loud phone calls, the HOA complaint, the grotesque performance at the party today. It was all so unoriginal. It was the playbook of a person whose sense of self was so fragile, it had to be constantly reinforced by belittling others. He sat down in the leather chair behind his desk, the one that had been Sarah's favorite. He didn't think about Clarissa's shrill voice or the $20 bill. He thought about a difficult case from last week, a young girl with an aggressive brain tumor. He thought about the research paper he was meant to be reviewing. He thought about the quiet satisfaction of pulling a stubborn weed from the earth. His world was vast and complex. It was filled with matters of life and death, of science and compassion. Clarissa Beaumont, with her petty cruelties and her perfect lawn, was a tiny, insignificant part of it. He would continue to nod politely, to tend his garden, to live his quiet life. He had work to do tomorrow. He had lives to save. He opened his laptop, and the noise from next door faded completely from his mind. Clarissa's humiliation festered. In the days following the garden party, she replayed the scene in her mind again and again. Each time, the memory was more galling. His calm, his silence, his simple nod. It was a masterful, unspoken rebuke. Her friends, when they called, spoke with a new, careful tone. They talked about the weather, about summer travel plans, about anything and everything except her neighbor. Their avoidance of the topic was, in itself, a form of judgment. It confirmed her suspicion. She had lost face. She had tried to demonstrate her power and had only succeeded in revealing her own ugly prejudice. Her frustration needed an outlet. Since a direct confrontation had failed so spectacularly, she resorted to more passive-aggressive tactics. One evening, after dark, she typed up a note. She used a generic font and printed it on plain paper, leaving it unsigned. A friendly reminder, it read, that neighborhood standards are what keep our property values high. This includes landscaping, exterior maintenance, and general tidiness. Let's all do our part to keep Sterling Creek beautiful. She folded it neatly and, under the cover of darkness, crept across her lawn and slipped it into Elijah's mailbox, her heart thumping with a mixture of malice and fear. It was a coward's act, and she knew it. The next morning, she watched him retrieve his mail. He paused for a moment as he read the note. She expected him to look around, to search for the source of the anonymous message. He didn't. He simply folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket along with the rest of his mail, and walked back inside his house. There was no change in his routine. His lawn remained immaculate. His flower beds were perfectly tended. The note, like all her other attacks, had seemingly vanished into the void of his indifference. Her next attempt was to poison the well. She tried to rally the other neighbors. She caught Mrs. Gable, who lived across the street, while she was walking her small, yapping poodle. "Eleanor," Clarissa began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of concern and camaraderie. "I'm just a little worried about the direction the neighborhood is heading." Mrs. Gable, a woman who was more interested in gossip than governance, looked intrigued. "What do you mean, dear?" "Well, the new man," Clarissa said, gesturing vaguely toward Elijah's house. "He just doesn't seem to be a good fit. He's very solitary. It's a bit unsettling, don't you think?" Mrs. Gable considered this for a moment. "He seems quiet enough to me," she said finally. "Keeps to himself. Mows his own lawn, which is more than I can say for that Henderson boy down the street." The conversation fizzled out. Mrs. Gable was not an ally. She tried again with another neighbor, Tom Riley, a retired executive who was fanatical about his own lawn. She saw him applying fertilizer one afternoon and wandered over. "Tom, that lawn is looking incredible," she started, the requisite opening pleasantry. "I just worry all our hard work will go to waste if some people don't pull their weight." She glanced meaningfully at Elijah's property. Tom Riley straightened up, wiping his brow. "Whose lawn are you talking about? His?" He pointed his spreader at Elijah's house. "That lawn looks fine to me. Better than fine. The man knows what he's doing." He then launched into a detailed explanation of soil aeration, and Clarissa was forced to stand and listen, trapped by her own failed machinations. She was isolated in her prejudice. Her neighbors, while perhaps sharing a quiet preference for homogeneity, were not willing to join her crusade. Elijah Vance had done nothing wrong. He was a model resident. He was quiet, he was tidy, and he minded his own business. Her complaints seemed unhinged, her hostility unwarranted. The more she pushed, the more she exposed her own character, not his. She was becoming the neighborhood problem, not him. This realization did not humble her, it enraged her. It felt like the world was conspiring against her, siding with him. The foundations of her control were cracking, and she could feel the carefully constructed order of her life beginning to slip from her grasp. She felt a rising tide of desperation. If she couldn't get him out, she would find some other way to make him break. Everyone had a breaking point. She just hadn't found his yet. Clarissa's professional life was another pillar of her identity. She ran a boutique marketing firm that catered to luxury brands. Her success was built on her reputation for being ruthless, meticulous, and always in control. For months, she had been pursuing a major contract with a high-end European automaker. Landing this account would elevate her firm to a new level, cementing her status as a major player. The final presentation was on a Wednesday morning. She had spent weeks preparing. Every slide was perfect, every talking point rehearsed. She walked into the boardroom feeling confident, powerful, invincible. She walked out 3 hours later, feeling like she had been punched in the gut. They had gone with another firm. The feedback was polite but brutal. "Your vision was excellent, Ms. Beaumont," the executive told her. "But we felt the other team had a more contemporary approach, a little more in touch with the current cultural climate." Cultural climate. The words echoed in her head as she drove home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. It was a coded message. They thought she was old-fashioned, out of touch. Her carefully curated image of sophisticated control had been perceived as rigid and dated. It was a professional death sentence. When she got home, the house was empty. Richard was at work. Maria had the day off. She stalked through the silent rooms, her rage a buzzing, physical thing in her chest. She threw her expensive leather briefcase onto the floor, the contents spilling across the marble entryway. She went to the bar, poured a large glass of scotch, and drank it in 3 angry gulps. The polished facade she presented to the world had cracked, and underneath was a raw, seething frustration. She felt a desperate need to break something. She walked to the large picture window in her living room that overlooked the backyard, and his. And there he was, Elijah. He was sitting on his back patio in a simple wooden chair, reading a book. Just sitting, quietly, peacefully. The sight of his tranquility in that moment was like a lit match thrown on gasoline. All her free-floating rage, her professional humiliation, her social frustration, it all coalesced, and found its target. Him. His calm was a mockery of her turmoil. His simple, unbothered existence was an unbearable insult to her spectacular failure. She slid open the glass door to her patio and stepped outside.
"Must be nice!"
she yelled, her voice raw and ugly.
"Must be nice to just sit around all day doing nothing!"
Elijah looked up from his book, his expression unstartled. He simply watched her.
"Some of us have to work for a living!"
she screamed, the words tearing out of her.
"Some of us have to build things, not just sit on our backsides in a house we don't deserve."
It was a full-blown tantrum, a complete loss of the control she prized so highly. She was unhinged, her face twisted with a rage that had little to do with him and everything to do with the wreck of her day. She wanted him to yell back. She wanted him to engage, to fight, to give her a tangible enemy to blame. Elijah closed his book, marking his page with his finger. He looked at her, a storm of fury on one side of the hedge, a sea of calm on the other. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was a mirror, and in it she could see herself, a screaming, bitter woman, unraveling in her own backyard. The sight was so pathetic that her own anger faltered. A wave of shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She had exposed her weakness to the one person she most wanted to feel superior to. Without another word, she spun around, fled back into her house, and slammed the glass door shut. She leaned against it, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the window, she saw him pick up his book again and resume reading, as if her outburst had been nothing more than a passing cloud. He had seen her at her absolute worst, stripped of her power and prestige. And in his quiet, unshakable composure, she sensed a strength she couldn't begin to understand. The heat of late summer settled over Sterling Creek, thick and oppressive. The sky, for days, had been a hazy, washed-out gray. On the local news, meteorologists spoke with increasing gravity about a storm system moving in from the west. They used words like severe, dangerous, and potential for widespread power outages. They advised residents to secure outdoor furniture, check their flashlights, and have a supply of water on hand. Clarissa watched the reports with a scoff. It was always the same thing. The media loved to whip people into a frenzy over a little bit of weather. A thunderstorm. So what? Her house was a fortress, solid and secure. The power almost never went out in Sterling Creek. Their lines were underground. She had more important things to worry about. The lost contract still stung, a fresh wound to her pride. Her carefully managed social life felt strained. The constant, silent presence of her neighbor was a low-grade hum of irritation beneath it all. A storm was a triviality. She spent the afternoon on the phone, trying to salvage what she could of her business, her voice sharp and demanding. "What do you mean they're reconsidering? We had a verbal agreement!" She snapped at one of her employees. Her control was slipping, both at work and at home, and it made her brittle and impatient. She ignored the darkening sky, the rising wind that began to whip the leaves of the old oak trees into a frenzy. From his study window, Elijah watched the same sky with a different perspective. He saw the ominous greenish tint, the way the clouds roiled and churned. He had seen skies like this before. He respected the power of nature. His approach was calm and methodical. He went outside and brought the cushions from his patio furniture into the garage. He checked the batteries in the 3 large flashlights he kept in a kitchen drawer, replacing one set that was weak. He filled a few empty jugs with tap water, just in case. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing. It was the same way he approached everything in his life, with foresight, logic, and the quiet respect for forces larger than himself. As dusk began to fall, The first fat drops of rain splattered against the windows. The wind picked up, howling now, a low, mournful sound that seemed to snake around the corners of the house. Clarissa was in her kitchen, pouring herself a second glass of wine, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The house was plunged into an abrupt, shocking darkness. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of the digital oven clock, the air conditioning, everything went silent. The only sounds were the wind and the increasingly heavy rain lashing against the glass. "For God's sake," she muttered, fumbling in a drawer for the decorative candles she kept but had never used. She found them, along with a book of matches, and lit one. The small, flickering flame did little to push back the oppressive darkness of the large house. The shadows leaped and danced on the walls, making familiar spaces look alien and threatening. She felt a prickle of unease. The house felt too big, too empty. Richard was out of town at a conference and wouldn't be back until Friday. Maria had gone home hours ago. She was completely alone. The storm intensified. A deafening clap of thunder rattled the windows in their frames, and she jumped, sloshing wine onto her hand. She walked through the dark house, the single candle her only guide. The perfect, orderly world she had built was gone, replaced by a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. Her security systems, her automated lights, her expensive appliances, all useless without electricity. Her control had been an illusion, dependent on a system she didn't manage. She felt a growing sense of vulnerability, a feeling she despised. She assured herself it was just a storm. The power would be back on in an hour or two. She would be fine. She settled onto her living room sofa, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and waited for the world to return to normal. But as she sat there in the dark, a strange, sharp pain began to blossom behind her left eye. The pain behind her eye was not like a normal headache. It was a sharp, splitting sensation, like a hot needle being pushed into her skull. Clarissa pressed the heel of her hand against her temple, trying to rub it away. Probably just stress, she told herself. The lost contract, the fight with Richard over the firm that morning, this stupid storm. It was all getting to her. She took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. The wind howled outside, a relentless assault on the house. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, vibrated through the floor. She tried to stand up, thinking a glass of water might help, but a wave of dizziness washed over her so suddenly and intensely that she had to grip the arm of the sofa to keep from falling. The room, already distorted by the flickering candlelight, seemed to tilt and sway. "What is happening?" she whispered into the darkness. Fear, cold and sharp, began to cut through her annoyance. This was more than just a headache. She sat back down, breathing heavily. A strange, tingling sensation started in the fingers of her left hand, a pins and needles feeling that began to creep up her arm. She tried to clench her fist, but her fingers felt clumsy, disobedient. Panic started to set in. She was alone. It was pitch black. The storm was raging. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She thought about her phone. It was on the kitchen counter, where she'd left it charging before the power went out. The kitchen seemed miles away. She pushed herself to her feet again, her legs feeling unsteady, as if they didn't quite belong to her. She used the furniture to guide her, one hand braced against a coffee table, the other against the back of a chair. The tingling had spread to her left leg now, and it felt heavy, like it was being dragged through wet sand. The pain in her head intensified with every step, a blinding, pulsating agony. When she finally reached the kitchen doorway, she leaned against the frame, panting. The candle she had left on the counter cast long, dancing shadows. Her phone was there, its screen dark. Just a few more feet. She took a shuffling step into the kitchen, then another. The left side of her face began to feel numb, and when she tried to speak, to call for help, even though no one was there to hear. The words came out as a garbled, nonsensical slur. The disconnect between her brain and her body was terrifying. She knew what she wanted to do, what she wanted to say, but the commands were getting lost somewhere along the way. She reached her left hand towards the counter, toward her phone, but her arm wouldn't cooperate. It felt disconnected, a useless weight hanging at her side. She could see the phone, her lifeline to the outside world, just inches from her fingertips. With a final, desperate lunge, she tried to grab it with her right hand, but her balance was gone. Her heavy left leg gave way completely, and she crashed to the hard tile floor. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. The candle on the counter flickered from the sudden rush of air, and then, cruelly, went out, plunging her back into absolute darkness. She lay there, on the cold floor of her perfect kitchen, the storm raging outside, and a terrifying storm raging inside her own body. She was conscious, she was aware, and she was utterly, completely helpless. Her control had not just slipped, it had been violently ripped away. Panic was a cold, venomous thing, flooding Clarissa's system. She was trapped inside her own body. Her mind was screaming commands. Get up, move, call for help. But her left side was a dead weight, utterly unresponsive. The numbness in her face had intensified, and a horrifying droop had taken over one side of her mouth. She tried to scream, but only a low, guttural moan escaped her lips. The sound was alien, animalistic. It wasn't her. The darkness was absolute. The sounds of the storm were her only companions. The torrential rain, the groaning of the old oak trees, the terrifying crack of lightning that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. Each thunderclap felt like a hammer blow against her skull. Lying on the floor, the world reduced to sound and the cold, hard pressure of the tile against her cheek, she had never felt so small, so fragile. Her entire life, she had equated power with wealth, status, and control over her environment. She could redecorate a room on a whim, buy a new car with a single phone call, intimidate an employee with a cold stare. She had built her identity around these external trappings of strength. Now, they were all meaningless. Her $500,000 kitchen was just a cold, dark room. Her social standing couldn't help her move her own arm. Her sharp, cutting words were reduced to unintelligible moans. Time became a distorted, meaningless concept. Was it minutes or an hour? She didn't know. Her thoughts, once sharp and precise, were becoming foggy, disjointed. Fragments of her life flashed through her mind. A memory of her father, a stern, demanding man who always told her that second place was the first loser. A vision of her wedding day, more a strategic merger than a celebration of love. The faces of her friends at the garden party, their expressions a mixture of shock and amusement as she tried to humiliate Elijah. The memory of him, standing there so calm and composed, came back to her with a shocking clarity. You people are usually so good with your hands. Her own words, so full of casual cruelty, echoed in the terrifying silence of our mind. She had looked at him and seen nothing but a stereotype, a lesser being to be managed and controlled. She had spent weeks trying to make his life miserable, trying to break his spirit. And for what? To protect a fragile sense of superiority that had just been obliterated in a matter of seconds by a misfiring synapse in her own brain. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over her. She was going to die here, alone, on the floor of her kitchen, in the dark. No one would find her until morning, maybe later if Maria didn't come. By then it would be too late. All her ambition, all her carefully acquired possessions, all her victories in the boardroom and the social arena, it all amounted to this, a lonely, pathetic end on a cold tile floor. The last thing she remembered before a wave of blackness threatened to pull her under was the sound of something shattering, a loud, sharp crack of breaking glass, distinct from the sounds of the storm. And then, a voice. A man's voice, calm and clear, cutting through the darkness. "Hello? Is anyone in there? Mrs. Beaumont?" The sound that had woken Elijah from his reading wasn't the thunder. It was the dull, heavy thud from next door. It was a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a sound of weight and finality. He had been sitting in his study, reading a medical journal by the light of a powerful battery-operated lantern. He paused, listening intently. The wind howled, but underneath it, he thought he'd heard something else. A faint moan. He waited. It could have been anything, a branch falling, furniture shifting in the wind. But a deep, instinctual part of him, the part honed by years in emergency rooms, felt a prickle of alarm. He went to the window that faced Clarissa's house. It was a wall of blackness. There were no candles, no flashlights visible inside, but the thud had come from the direction of her kitchen. He grabbed one of his large flashlights and his cell phone, though he knew there was no service, and put on a raincoat. The rain was coming down in solid, blinding sheets as he stepped outside. He made his way across the soggy lawn to her back patio, the flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. He peered through the glass door into her kitchen. The beam landed on a wine glass lying on its side on the floor, a dark pool of red spreading around it. And then he saw her. She was a heap on the floor, partially hidden by the kitchen island. "Mrs. Beaumont!" he called out, his voice loud against the glass. No response. He tried the handle. Locked. He banged on the door. "Clarissa! Can you hear me?" Still nothing. He didn't waste any more time. He looked around, found a heavy ceramic planter on her patio, hefted it, and with a controlled, powerful motion, smashed it through the glass pane of the door. The sound was sharp and explosive. He reached through the broken pane, carefully avoiding the jagged edges, unlocked the door from the inside, and let himself in. The moment his flashlight beam fell fully on her face, he knew. He didn't need a CAT scan or an MRI. The facial droop, the fixed and slightly dilated pupil on one side, the unresponsive posture. It was a classic textbook stroke. All the animosity, all the insults, all the petty cruelty she had directed at him vanished from his mind. She wasn't Clarissa Beaumont, his spiteful neighbor. She was a patient, and she was in critical danger. He knelt beside her, his movements swift and sure. "Clarissa, my name is Elijah. I'm here to help you. Can you squeeze my hand?" He placed his fingers in her right hand, the one he suspected was still functional. He felt a faint, weak pressure. Good, she was conscious. He checked her airway, tilting her head back slightly to ensure she could breathe. He noted the time. In cases like this, every second counted. The window for administering clot-busting drugs was incredibly small. His actions in the next few minutes could mean the difference between her full recovery and permanent, devastating disability. Or life and death. His phone had no signal to call 911. He would have to stabilize her and wait for the storm to pass, or for a chance to get help. He remembered the landline in his study. He ran back to his house, rain soaking him instantly, and grabbed his own cordless phone, praying his line was still working. It was. He dialed 911, the dispatcher's voice a miracle of calm in the chaos. "I'm at 112 Sterling Oak Court," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "My neighbor at 114 has had an acute cerebrovascular accident. Classic signs of a major ischemic stroke. I am a physician. I need an ambulance here as soon as the storm breaks. She is unresponsive, but breathing." He gave the dispatcher all the necessary information, his medical terminology precise and clear. Then he ran back to her side. He found pillows to prop up her head and shoulders slightly. He covered her with the blanket from the sofa to prevent shock. He monitored her breathing and her pulse, his fingers pressed gently against her neck. He was a beacon of calm and competence in the center of a maelstrom. He was no longer just her neighbor. He was her doctor. And as he knelt on the floor of her dark, perfect kitchen, holding a flashlight on her face and counting her breaths, the man whose hands she had mocked was using those same hands to save her life. The first thing Clarissa was aware of was the beeping, a steady, rhythmic beep that was both annoying and, in a strange way, reassuring. The second was the light. It was a flat, artificial light, filtering through her eyelids. She tried to open them, but they felt heavy, glued shut. A thick fog enveloped her brain, making thought a slow, difficult process. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the cold floor, the darkness, the terror. She managed to pry her eyes open. The world was blurry at first, a smear of white and pale green. She was in a bed, a hospital bed. An IV tube was taped to her right hand. The beeping was coming from a machine beside her. She turned her head slowly. The movement felt sluggish, disconnected. Richard was asleep in a chair in the corner of the room, his face etched with worry even in slumber. She was in a hospital. She was alive. A nurse came in, a kind-faced woman with a warm smile. "Well, hello there. Welcome back," she said softly. "You gave us all quite a scare." Clarissa tried to ask what happened, but the words wouldn't form properly. A frustrating jumble of sounds came out. The nurse seemed to understand. "It's okay, take it easy. You had a stroke. A pretty serious one. You're at Sterling General." The word stroke landed like a physical blow. It was something that happened to old people, to unhealthy people. Not to her. Later that day, a doctor came in. He was a tall man with silver hair and a kind but serious expression. He introduced himself as Dr. Matthews, the head of the neurology department. Richard was awake now, standing by her bedside, holding her hand. "Clarissa," Dr. Matthews began, his voice gentle. "You are an incredibly lucky woman." He explained the medical details in terms she could barely follow: a clot, an artery, a lack of oxygen to the brain. "The paramedics were able to get to you as soon as the worst of the storm passed," he continued. "They administered a thrombolytic drug, a clot buster, on the way here." He paused, looking at her intently. "The only reason that drug had any chance of working, and the only reason you have survived this with what appears to be minimal long-term damage, is because of what happened before the ambulance arrived. The person who found you didn't just call for help. They stabilized you. They positioned you correctly to protect your airway. They accurately diagnosed the type of stroke, which allowed them to give the paramedics critical information. They single-handedly saved your life and preserved your brain function." Clarissa stared at him, confused. Who? The storm, the broken glass, a voice in the dark. It was all a hazy, terrifying dream. Richard squeezed her hand. "It was our neighbor, honey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The man who just moved in next door. Elijah Vance. He broke in and found you." Clarissa's mind recoiled. Elijah. The man she had tormented. The man she tried to humiliate. He had found her? Dr. Matthews smiled. "I've never seen such brilliant first response care in the field. Whoever this man is, he did everything perfectly. I told him as much myself when he called this morning to check on you." The doctor looked down at his chart, then back up at her. "He's a very impressive man. It's not every day you get saved by one of the country's top neurosurgeons." The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room. Clarissa felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Richard was looking at the doctor, bewildered. "I'm sorry," Richard said. "A neurosurgeon? Our neighbor?" Dr. Matthews nodded, a look of surprise on his face. "You didn't know? That's Dr. Elijah Vance. He's the head of neurosurgery over at University Hospital. Wrote the book on microvascular decompression surgery. He's a legend. We've been trying to recruit him here for years." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Dr. Elijah Vance, head of neurosurgery. A legend. The man who mowed his own lawn. The man who wore simple jeans. The man she had tried to pay $20 to trim her hedges. The man whose hands, whose brilliant, skilled, life-saving hands, she had mocked as being good for manual labor. The truth was so immense, so devastating, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, crushing her. The beeping of the machine beside her bed suddenly seemed to grow louder, each beep a merciless punctuation mark at the end of the sentence that was her own monumental, soul-shattering ignorance. Coming home from the hospital was a surreal experience. The house, once her fortress of control, now felt like a crime scene. A large piece of plywood covered the shattered glass of the patio door. The wine stain was gone from the kitchen floor, scrubbed away by Maria, but Clarissa could still see it in her mind. Her body was a stranger to her. Her left side was weak, her movements slow and deliberate. She had to attend physical therapy 3 times a week. Her speech, though improving, was sometimes slurred when she was tired. She, Clarissa Beaumont, was now a person who needed help. But the physical recovery was nothing compared to the psychological torment. She was haunted, not by the stroke, but by the crushing weight of her own shame. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elijah's calm face. She heard her own shrill, ugly words. "You people are usually so good with your hands." The memory made her physically ill. It was a poison that had been inside her all along, and now she was forced to swallow it. She would sit in her living room, in the very chair from which she had watched and judged him, and she would see him in his yard. He was still the same. His routine had not changed. He still mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He still tended his roses. He still retrieved his mail with a quiet, unhurried grace. But now, when she looked at him, she didn't see a simple laborer. She saw Dr. Elijah Vance, a brilliant surgeon, a man of immense skill and quiet dignity. She saw the man who had knelt on her floor in the dark and saved her life. The world had been turned upside down. The man she had deemed inferior was, by any meaningful measure, her superior. He saved lives. He advanced science. He lived a life of purpose and quiet integrity. And what did she do? She sold expensive things to rich people. She enforced petty neighborhood rules. She judged people based on the color of their skin. The sheer, staggering arrogance of her behavior was a revelation that left her breathless. Her friends called, their voices full of feigned sympathy that barely concealed their ravenous curiosity. "Clarissa, we heard! It's just a miracle!" Barbara gushed over the phone. And can you believe it was him, the neighbor, a famous doctor? Who would have thought? Clarissa had no answer. Every one of Barbara's cheerful, gossipy words was a small, sharp stab. Her friends had been witnesses to her cruelty. Now they were witnesses to her humiliation. She started avoiding their calls. Richard tried to help. He was relieved and grateful, and he couldn't stop talking about it. "I'm going to send him the most expensive bottle of scotch I can find," he announced one evening. "We should have him over for dinner. We need to thank him properly." Clarissa flinched. The thought of facing him, of having to look him in the eye, was unbearable. How could she possibly thank him? What words could possibly contain the depth of her shame and the magnitude of her debt to him? "Thank you for saving my life after I treated you like dirt." Days turned into a week, then 2. She watched him from her window like a ghost haunting her own home. She saw him leave for work in the morning and return in the evening. She saw him carrying his groceries. A normal life. A good life. He never looked her way. He never made any move to speak to her. It was as if the night of the storm, the night he broke into her house and held her life in his hands, had never happened. His continued silence was not an act of malice. She knew that now. It was an act of grace. He was giving her space. He was not demanding an apology or seeking recognition. He was simply allowing her to exist with her shame, to process it on her own. And that quiet, unspoken act of kindness was, in its own way, more painful than any accusation he could have leveled against her. He was not just a better surgeon. He was a better person. And the chasm between them seemed impossibly wide. 3 weeks after she came home, Clarissa knew she couldn't hide any longer. The silence had become a screaming void. Every day she delayed was another layer of cowardice added to her mountain of shame. She had to face him. She had to say the words. It was a Saturday morning, bright and clear. She saw him in his yard, kneeling by the rose bushes that bordered their properties, the same spot where she had committed her worst offense. His back was to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat. This was harder than any business negotiation, harder than any public speaking engagement. This was about laying her own rotten soul bare. She took a deep breath, opened her patio door, and walked slowly, unsteadily, across her perfect lawn, until she reached the low hedge that separated their worlds. "Dr. Vance," she said. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. He stopped what he was doing and slowly stood up, turning to face her. He had taken off his work gloves. His hands were bare. Those hands. She couldn't look at them. He looked at her, his expression calm, patient. He did not speak. He simply waited. She started, then stopped. The words were stuck in her throat, choked by shame. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. "I don't know what to say." He remained silent, allowing her the space to struggle. It was the kindest and hardest thing he could have done. "What I did," she finally managed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What I said to you. At the party. The note. Everything. There is no excuse for it. It was ugly. It was hateful. And I am so sorry." The last words were a sob. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, streaming down her face. She didn't try to wipe them away. This was a moment for ugliness, for a raw and honest confession. She took another ragged breath. "You saved my life. After I treated you with such contempt. You had every reason to leave me on that floor. No one would have blamed you." His gaze never wavered. It wasn't pitying. It wasn't judgmental. It was just clear. "That's not who I am, Mrs. Beaumont," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You were a person in need of help. That's all I saw." The simplicity of his statement was devastating. In a world where she saw race, status, and exteriors, he saw a human being. The contrast between their two worldviews laid her bare. "I was wrong," she whispered, looking at the ground. "About everything. I was so wrong." She finally found the courage to look up and meet his eyes. "I know thank you isn't enough. It will never be enough. But thank you, Dr. Vance, for saving my life, and for not hating me." For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed his face. It wasn't a smile, not exactly. It was something softer. "My name is Elijah," he said quietly. "And I don't have time for hate Clarissa. Life is too short. He offered a small nod, the same nod that had once infuriated her. But this time, it felt different. It felt like forgiveness. It felt like an ending and a beginning. He then turned back to his roses, giving her the privacy to retreat. She walked back to her house, her body trembling, feeling as though she had just shed a heavy, toxic skin. The journey ahead was long. Changing the habits of a lifetime would not be easy. But for the first time, she felt the possibility of becoming someone better. The hedge between their properties was still there, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a line she had finally, painfully, learned to cross. When we look at the story of Clarissa and Elijah, it's easy to dismiss Clarissa as simply a bad person. But the roots of her behavior are deeper and more complex than simple malice. Her actions stemmed from a profound and crippling insecurity, masked by wealth and a desperate need for control. Her entire sense of self-worth was built on external validation. Her perfect house, her social standing, her ability to look down on others. Elijah's arrival threatened this fragile ecosystem. Because he did not fit her narrow, prejudiced worldview of who should live in Sterling Creek, his very presence was a challenge to her identity. Her racism wasn't just hatred. It was a defense mechanism. By trying to diminish him, she was trying to reinforce her own shaky sense of superiority. His refusal to be diminished, his quiet dignity, was something her worldview couldn't process, which is why his composure infuriated her more than any angry retort would have. How could a situation like this have been handled differently? If Elijah had chosen a different path, what might have happened? Let's consider some hypotheticals. If Elijah had aggressively confronted Clarissa after her first insults, he might have silenced her temporarily, but it likely would have escalated the conflict, allowing her to paint him as the angry black man, fulfilling another toxic stereotype, and potentially turning the indifferent neighbors against him. If he had involved lawyers or the HOA board to file a harassment complaint, he might have won a legal victory, but it would have enmeshed him in a bitter, protracted war with a neighbor determined to make his life hell. His chosen path, the path of unshakable calm and quiet integrity, was the most powerful of all. It wasn't passive. It was an active refusal to participate in her ugly reality. By not reacting, he held up a mirror, forcing her and those around her to see the ugliness of her behavior without distraction. He protected his peace by refusing to let her poison dictate his actions. The ultimate lesson from this story is about the nature of true strength and the poison of prejudice. Clarissa believed strength was about control, dominance, and outward appearances. The story shows us that this is a fragile, hollow form of power. True strength, as embodied by Elijah, is internal. It is integrity, compassion, self-respect, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth, independent of anyone else's validation or judgment. Prejudice is revealed for what it truly is, a symptom of profound personal weakness and fear. It is the tool of those who are so insecure in their own standing that they must invent a hierarchy where they are on top. This story teaches us that the judgments we make about others are rarely about them. They are almost always a reflection of our own insecurities, our own fears, and the limitations of our own character. It reminds us that behind every face is a story we do not know, a depth we cannot see from the surface. A person's job, their clothes, or the color of their skin is just the cover of a book. The real story, the one that matters, is written on the pages within. I'd like to leave you with a few questions to think about, and I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever profoundly misjudged someone based on a first impression, only to learn later how wrong you were? What do you think is the hardest part of offering a truly sincere apology after you've deeply wronged someone. Your engagement helps our channel grow and allows us to continue telling stories that we hope can make a difference. Thank you for listening.